Greetings to all the revolutionary fighters and commissars and fighters in the struggle for economic freedom in our lifetime. We are now here to present the first reading in the EFF book club, which we had said is the founding manifesto of the economic freedom fighters. So we are basically going to just give the broad read guidelines so that all of us, when we engage in this perspective, we know what is the context of the key issues that are contained in the founding manifesto of the economic freedom fighters. And of utmost importance is the fact that we say that we are a revolutionary movement as the economic freedom fighters. And as a revolutionary movement, we need to base all our actions on proper revolutionary theory. And we learned this from Karl Marx, who said that practice without theory is blind. Theory without practice is sterile. Theory becomes a material force as soon as it is absorbed by the masses. So that is the important thing, that we must never underestimate the importance and the critical value of theory in a revolutionary struggle, like the one we're engaged in as the economic freedom fighters. But also Lenin said later on that without revolutionary theory, there can never be a revolutionary movement. So whatever we do, we seek to make sure that we align both theory and practice. We must not just be an organization that makes practical interventions without being informed by proper theoretical grounding. So today we're going to talk about the EFF Founding Manifesto, which, as we said, is the most important document and perspective in the life of the economic freedom fighters. Now, the EFF Founding Manifesto was adopted in the National Assembly on what is to be done, which was called by progressive forces in 2013. And then on the 26th of July, adopted a decision that we should found a political emancipation movement, an emancipation movement that must be based on the key principles that are contained in the founding manifesto of the EFF. The founding manifesto of the EFF has been circulated widely on Twitter. It is in the website of the economic freedom fighters, and those that are looking for it can gain access to it easily, even on the link that will appear on all the YouTube postings of the EFF. So the significance of the EFF founding manifesto's adoption on the 26th of July coincides with the fact that the 26th July is a very important movement, a day in the history, a revolutionary history of Cuba. So on the 26th of July 1953, the revolutionary forces in Cuba, led by Fidel Castro, began a revolution that later on culminated in the victory of left progressive forces on the 1st of January 1959, after they had fought relentlessly and courageously against the Batista regime in Cuba. So we are deriving inspiration from those fighters of Fidel Castro, of Che Guevara, of Raul Castro, of Comandante Risket, and a variety of many other revolutionary commanders that fought in the struggle in Cuba. So that significance of the EFF being the July 26th movement is a very significant component of our struggle. Now, the founding manifesto of the EFF has got 138 paragraphs. So since the formation of the EFF, the founding manifesto has never been amended. And the essence is that it must not be amended because it is the foundation of the organization. So once you tamper out the foundation, you are going to have catastrophic organizational consequences. So the founding manifesto is the value base, the ideological guide, the political guide of every action that the economic freedom fighters engages in. So the 138 pages are divided into basically 6 key themes. Theme number 1 is, where do we come from as the people? And what defines our historical struggles? What is our history? Theme number 2 is, where are we currently? What are the current conditions that define all our people? Then theme number 3 is, what is the diagnosis? What is our diagnosis of the current political conditions, and what should happen in that regard? Then theme number 4 is, who are we? Like, who are we? What is the nature and character of the economic freedom fighters? And then the next theme is, where are we going? What is to be done? What do we seek to achieve as the economic emancipation movement? And then the last theme is who stands to benefit? The who stands to benefit basically responds to the question of who are the primary motive forces in the struggle for economic freedom in our lifetime. Now, responding to all these questions, we must first maybe emphasize that the founding manifesto of the EFF starts by quoting Frantz Fanon, who says that each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And then we then say that as the generation of economic freedom fighters, we have set our mission as the mission to fight for the total economic emancipation for the people of South Africa, of the African continent, and the entire African diaspora. Where do we come from? We come from a history of land disposition, of colonial conquest, of dehumanizing, of beheading of our people. So currently, we appreciate that whilst there have been minor progress in terms of recognizing particularly black people and Africans in particular as human beings, for the longest part of history, we were not recognized as human beings. We had to just exist. We were not living. We were just appendages to the white capitalist and colonial establishment, which was just using us as slaves, as a easily disposable and cheap labor. And for the longest time, we had been dispossessed of our land, we're forced into waged labor, and we have not got to benefit anything meaningfully out of the fact that we are in control of a huge land, we're in control of huge mineral resources and reserves that are building the industrial world in the economy. But we acknowledge in the first part of the EFF Founding Manifesto, which is basically paragraph 1 to 7, that we are not the inverters of the struggle. We are not the first to come in the war against colonial occupation. We are not the first people to fight for the total emancipation of our people. And despite the fact that we're not the first, we still, however, acknowledge that we have not yet won the battle. We have not won the battle against colonial expansion. We are still experiencing the results, the vestiges, the consequences of colonial occupation and conquest of our people. We are still a defeated people. So if anyone thinks that we are now victorious, we must then lay the arms, we must just coexist with everyone else there, you are in a wrong world. Then although we acknowledge that there are those that came before us, we appreciate that now our struggle is just a continuation of those that fought before us. So we are in a relay race of struggle. So in a relay race, when you have got in athletics, like 4 runners, there are those who run for the first 100 meters, the second 100 meters, the third 100 meters, and then that the ones who take the baton to run towards the finish line. So we then define ourselves as this generation as the generation that has taken the baton and is going to fight and run the race until the finish line. So the generation of economic freedom fighters is the generation that is fighting for the total emancipation of our people. That is the acknowledgement that we make in the first component of our struggle. And then the second component that then we deal with as the EFF is the issue of what is our diagnosis of society. So that is mostly in one of the biggest, the longest paragraph in the Economic Freedom Fighters Manifesto is paragraph 25. So if you check in the founding manifesto of the EFF, which is contained in this book, the founding, the coming revolution, you realize that paragraph 25 is the most important paragraph because it has got important issues that are contained there in the manner that it is. Like it makes a diagnosis of the challenges that are confronting all of us. What is our characterization of the politics and the fact that a lot of progressive left forces have been absorbed into the neo-colonial collaborative political movements and are not fighting for the total emancipation of our people. But also we acknowledge that the right-wing options have never got to liberate our people much more meaningfully. If you read the diagnosis, the 15 diagnoses that are found in that important paragraph, you will realize that it was almost prophetic predictions of exactly what is going to happen with the liberation movements, that the liberation movements, not only in South Africa, have not been correct instruments for total emancipation. Instead, they did what Lenin predicted on the document called the National Question, that let us just continue with it. Let us just continue with what the colonizers and the colonialists established. They did what Fanon basically predicted in the Riches of the Earth, that the post-colonial governments, in most instances, they just inherit an economy that they have got no understanding of. They've got no clue of how many people stay in their countries. They've got no clue in terms of the extent of wealth that is underneath their own economies. So that is basically the third theme that is dealt with in the founding manifesto of the EFF. And then the fourth theme that is dealt with there is, where are we going? What is to be done? What do we seek to achieve as the economic freedom fighters? What is our mission? Like what constitutes our core program? What will make us content that now we've realized the victory of the struggle for economic freedom? And amidst those are the 7 non-negotiable cardinal pillars in the struggle for economic freedom in our lifetime. The 7 cardinal pillars, non-negotiable cardinal pillars, are the core of what we basically are fighting for. Cardinal pillar number 1 is expropriation of South Africa's land without compensation for equal redistribution in use. We are saying that we should expropriate all South Africa's land for equal redistribution. And this should inspire all other revolutionary forces in other parts of the continent, that let us make all land to be under the custodianship of the state, because we have realized and acknowledged that the piece-by-piece redistribution of land that defines a lot of post-colonial governments have never succeeded. So that is why majority of land, a bigger component of the land in the entire African continent, is still owned by the former colonizers. Cardinal pillar number 2 is nationalization of mines, banks, and other strategic sectors of the economy without compensation. We're basically saying that the critical components of mines, of the banks, should be under the ownership and control of the state so that they can benefit all the people. But we then also highlight the strategic sectors: energy production, key logistics like your Transnet and the airlines must be under the control and ownership of the state. Then the third component, that is actually one of the most distinguishing factors, the third pillar, is building state and government capacity, which will lead to the abolishment of tenders. What will distinguish the EFF in government to all these other governments that are there in all parts of the African continent, particularly in South Africa, is that we're going to have internal capacity to build schools, to build roads, to basically build everything else that is needed, to produce our own medicines, to produce our own medical equipment, ventilators, and whatever is needed. The state must have capacity, because that in any way are the daily functions that the state has to deal with. But if you check in the current context, what governments do is to be just administrators of tenders. Every little function that they have to fulfill, they give that to private sector to fulfill on their behalf. And in almost all instances, the private sector inflates prices and deliver less quality services. There's no value for money out of it. So better services could have been delivered if the state had direct involvement in the delivery of services. So then the fourth pillar is free quality education, healthcare, houses, and sanitation for all. To say that we need quality education to be provided for all up until post-secondary education, and that we must expand the post-secondary education and training space. We must provide quality health care for all the people. I think the current pandemic has illustrated that it is upon all of us to make sure that each and every citizen in the entire world is healthy, because just a health disturbance of one individual can cause catastrophic consequences for all of humanity in the whole world. It can collapse the global economy. So we have an obligation to make sure that everyone else has got access to basic quality health care. And you cannot detach quality health care from the fact that each and every person must have access to quality water, to proper sanitation, and proper human settlements. So those are linked in terms of what we are fighting for as the economic freedom fighters. Then the fifth pillar is massive protected industrial expansion. Massive protected industrial development to create millions of sustainable jobs, including the introduction of minimum wages in order to close the wage gap between the rich and the poor, close the apartheid wage gap, and promote rapid career paths for Africans in the workplace. That is cardinal pillar number 5. To say that whilst we appreciate that we should give equal access of the existing productive forces like the mines, the banks, we carry an obligation to build massive protected industrial expansion. All African countries, all the oppressed world should appreciate what was said by Thomas Sankara, that colonialism exists with us every day. Like from the food that we eat in Africa, majority of us is produced elsewhere. The phones that we use, the cars that we use, the clothes that we wear, everything else that we utilize is as a result of the imperialist control of the African continent. We have got no capacity to even produce the basic things that we need. Like it's not even a joke that you find even a toothpick, like a matchstick, that is produced in China or in other parts of the world. The daily food that we consume is produced in other parts of the world. And that shouldn't be so. We should produce our own goods and services, including sophisticated things like shipments and like cars, like everything else, like electronics, like aeroplanes. Why is it that all other parts of the world can do so, but ourselves cannot deal with that in that fashion? Then cardinal plan number 6 is massive development of the African economy and advocating for a move from reconciliation to justice in the entire continent. Now, this is very important, that we must never ever think that the development of South Africa or any components of the colonized Africa will sustainably develop all of us. You will not be able to avoid immigration for economic purposes. So we carry an obligation to promote intra-African trade and intra-African development. So all forms that got to develop all of us collectively, we must engage in. If Eskom has got capacity to provide electricity for the entire of the African continent, it should do so in a financially sustainable way. If Transnet can build capacity to interlink the entire African continent, it should do so. If another company that is operating in Nigeria and the DRC can provide a service for the entire African continent, it should do so in a financially sustainable way, so that the development of all of us ultimately uplifts the lives of Africans. But if you check the conditions of Africa now, all of us are the major supporters of our former colonizers. Our railway lines, our transport systems, our trade routes, all of them lead to the sea with the intention of reaching the destinations which are our former colonizers. And that should be discontinued in favor of intra-African trade, with a view of making sure that the entire African continent is developed. And then the seventh pillar is open, accountable, corrupt-free government and society without fear of victimization by state agencies. Now, that is very important, that in pursuit of a developmental program, a program for economic emancipation in our lifetime, we should fight against all forms of corruption, where leaders redirect state resources to their pockets. The resources should always benefit the people in terms of what should happen. So that is the fourth broad theme that the founding manifesto of the EFF deals with. But there are also complementary pillars to the 7. So the 7 are non-negotiable. Even the complementary pillars are non-negotiable. And you need to go and read and internalize each and every component of the complementary pillars in the founding manifesto of the EFF. So basically everything else that we say in parliament and all the issues that we express are consistent with the founding manifesto of the EFF. If you check on the land question, for instance, we are already leading the discourse in South Africa on land expropriation without compensation. We are the first ones to table a bill in parliament on creation of a state bank. We have tabled a motion before on provision of free education for all. We have come with a substantial policy proposals in terms of building state capacity. So if you check the municipalities of the EFF, which are effective and responsive to the founding manifesto, have already begun to win the battle of building internal state capacity by insourcing workers, by making sure that governments perform their own functions. So in almost all these components, whenever we want to make key policy interventions as the economic freedom fighters, we rely on these founding manifesto cardinal pillars in terms of these issues. Our fight against corruption is based on the fact that we are founded on a principle, a cardinal pillar that says that we must fight against all forms of production. Our proposals in terms of industrial policy is based on what the founding manifesto of the EFF always says. Now, the complementary cardinal pillars speaks to a variety of key components. I'll just highlight some of the key issues that are of public importance. Like we speak about decentralized spatial development and building of new cities. So all forms of colonialism in the entire African continent got to concentrate economic activity in areas where the colonial settlers were most concentrated at. So you have got very few areas where there's economic activity. So in here in South Africa, Gauteng, Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, a component of KwaZulu-Natal account for more than 70% of economic activity. And that is not sustainable. We need to decentralize development. We must build new cities in all parts of South Africa, but also all parts of the African continent, so that we limit the unnecessary migration for economic purposes. But also we're saying that once we have got a government that has been established by the economic freedom fighters, we must have quality services that will compel all public representatives to use public services. So that is part of the complementary pillars that we then deal with in that context. But also we commit to progressive internationalism as one of the complementary pillars, that our commitment to socialist humanity must not be regionalistic, must not be tribal, must not be just nationalistic. We must espouse and live by what Julius Nyerere said, that any form of nationalism that is not Pan-Africanist is dangerous and reactionary. So we are committed to progressive internationalism that appreciates that all of us must liberate the entirety of humanity. But also we call for monetary and fiscal stability, that at all times a government must have enough resources to respond to all the developmental challenges that it is confronted with on a daily basis. There must never be a time where governments go to beg its private citizens for money to do anything. So what government is doing of just begging private citizens for money to do anything is not part of the founding manifesto of the EFF. Money should be collected maximally through taxation, by dealing decisively with tax avoidance and all these other wrong things that happen at multinational level. But the essence is that there must be some degree of stability in terms of the fiscal position of the state. But also we then speak in the complementary pillars what is important, the transformation of the criminal justice system, the support that must be given to research, innovation, and enterprise development. That we should not underestimate the fact that from time to time we must innovate and come with new components that are going to then deal with. So that component of the founding manifesto of the EFF deals much more substantially with what we stand for as the organization. And then the coming component of the founding manifesto is, who are we? Who are we who have got these huge aspirations to develop South Africa, the African continent, bring true liberation to all the people? We then say that the economic freedom fighters is an economic emancipation movement. An economic emancipation movement that ascribes to a Marxist, Leninist, and Fanonian school of thought. That is what we are. That is who we are as an organization, because we appreciate that we cannot be a revolutionary movement that is not informed by revolutionary theories. So if you ever think that you can just exist and rely on temporary so-called pragmatic solutions on a day-to-day basis without a thorough ideological grounding, you will not be able to have an organization that is going to drive us for the long time. So we have got a clear commitment to the class struggle that is properly contextualized in the Marxist, Leninist, and Fanonian school of thought. And why do we choose Karl Marx, as our theoretical guide? Why do we choose Marxism? Because Marxism is science. Marxism is science. So and science is knowledge that has been gained through thorough observation, has been tested, and has been found to be true beyond any reasonable doubt. So you've got physical sciences that speaks about mixture of certain chemicals plus water to turn into this color. So whatever you do, that color will be the ultimate outcome. You've got mathematical sciences, which says that whatever is the case, 1 + 1 becomes 2. So in social sciences, in politics, in revolutionary politics, you've got science and the scientific tools of analysis that we use as the economic freedom fighters is Marxist, Leninist, Fanonian school of thought. So we rely on Marx because he teaches us about the class struggle, an appreciation that we are engaged in a class struggle. We are engaged in a struggle against the exploitation of one class by another. That we are not just seeking for some superfluous class unity. We are fighting a class war. We are on the side of the class that does not own the means of production. We are on the side of the working class and the poor. So every decision that we take as the EFF, the first question is, how does this benefit the working class? And we learn that from Karl Marx. There's a lot of writings that come from there, but also Karl Marx teaches us about capitalism. So capitalism has to be understood because we are waging the struggle for economic freedom in a capitalist world. So we should, all of us, appreciate that we are fighting this struggle in a capitalist world. And the most powerful and seminal characterization of capital was done by Karl Marx in the successive writings about the nature and character of capitalism. And also all of us, as part of this enrichment, we must read the Communist Manifesto, which basically is a path of what all left revolutionary forces must engage in. And what we learn from Lenin? From Lenin, we learn basically 3 major components. Like, we learn a proper characterization of the state. The fact that what we call the state, which is a combination of government, the military, parliaments, judiciary, and in some components, they are representatives in the media. All of that is, in most instances, a product of the fact that you can never reconcile the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. You can never reconcile the interests of those who own the means of production and those that do not own. So Lenin says in State and Revolution that as the state is a product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms, that despite the fact that it has emerged out of those class antagonisms that can never be reconciled, the state still remains an instrument of class rule, meaning that those that are in charge of society are the ones who use the state to then rule over the other class for their own private benefits. And governments in that context, Karl Marx said, they are nothing but a committee that manages the common affairs of the bourgeoisie of the capitalist. So everyone else who is government under a capitalist state is nothing but a committee that manages the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. So from Lenin, that is what we learn. But also we learn from Lenin the theory and practice of organization. So organizational theory, which we ascribe to, we are learning from the Leninist point of view. So if you check in the EFF constitution, we say that part of the organizational principles is democratic centralism. So that is a Leninist principle which we derive from how Lenin characterized organization, that we should have an organization that is unitary, that appreciates that once decisions have been taken, the right of those who were disagreeing before now it dwindles into insignificance. So then there must be unity of the organization, there must be unity of peoples, which is democratically derived at all times. But also from Lenin, we learn the practice of socialism. That what do we do as a revolutionary movement that is presiding over a socialist government? Because Lenin was the first to lead the greatest socialist revolution in Russia that got to develop the productive forces in Russia. And of course, there are some wrong narratives of the character and nature that got to define Russia. But it is the greatest socialist revolution that got to inspire and fund a lot of liberation movements in the entire world. So without the direct involvement of the Soviet Union that whose architecture was done by Lenin, South Africa possibly could have not been liberated, because part of the capitulation of the colonial and apartheid government was the fear that the left forces in the world, Cuba and all these progressive forces, were going to annihilate and defeat militarily the white regime. So that is what we learn from Lenin. What do we learn from Fanon? So we learn and appreciate the fact that we are, of course, in a class struggle, but this class struggle is happening in an anti-colonial setting. We are an anti-colonial movement. That is another aspect that we cannot divorce ourselves from. So unlike a left organization, a Marxist organization, let's say in the United States or in Britain, they don't have the unique experiences of colonialism that we are still defined and experiencing in the African setting. So we need a tool of analysis to analyze that, to say that we should be guided by a proper ideological tools of analysis and guide to action. And in this context is the Fanonian school of thought. And we also appreciate that our struggle happens in a context where there is some degree of nationalism and the nationalist character. So, and we cannot detach the fact that whilst we are oppressed and exploited as a class, we are also oppressed as Black people. And we cannot just want to fight in an emotional way without any proper ideological tools of analysis. And Fanon is relevant in terms of that perspective. So we must, all of us, familiarize ourselves with a variety of books that Fanon has written, including this book, which is part of what was prescribed, The Wretched of the Earth, by Frantz Fanon. We must learn from that as well. And that is the essence of our struggle in terms of what should happen. And there's something which a lot of fighters have not got to pay attention in the founding manifesto of the EFF, that we also acknowledge a very important component, that we acknowledge and appreciate the heterodox reading of economic history in the world. Not all the solutions that they provide, but the reading of economic history in the world. So it is in the founding manifesto of the EFF, and all of us should familiarize ourselves in terms of all of those issues. And then we then say in the last component of the founding manifesto of who stands to benefit, basically to emphasize that at the center of our struggle for economic freedom, those that stand to benefit is the African working class, in particular women. And one of the critical components that actually is contained importantly highlighted in the complementary pillars is our feminist character as the EFF, that we're fighting for the equality of all sexes. We do not ascribe to sexism. We do not ascribe to a view that says that women are of lesser importance, that they must be reduced to kitchens and as just supporters of men. We are all equal. We must be given equal roles in all spheres of society. That is what we ascribe to as the economic freedom fighters. Now, just to give a quick highlight in terms of what then becomes our path to power. What do we do to realize this economic freedom in our lifetime? One is that we must have individual conviction. So each and every one of us who call themselves a fighter or supports the struggle for economic freedom should have individual conviction on the ideals of the economic freedom fighters. And when you become leadership, it's even worse. Don't be selective that I only ascribe to this component of the EFF. I don't ascribe to the other. You must holistically be convinced about the struggle for economic freedom. And once an individual is convinced, then you must then begin to organize others. And we must have a strong organization. So it's individual conviction, organizational conviction, that the organization as a whole must be convinced about what it stands for. It will never make a mistake whether its individual leaders are there or not. So we need a strong organization. And a strong organization will give us the power to mobilize the masses behind the struggle for economic freedom. You know that in the earlier quote that we quoted, Karl Marx says that practice without theory is blind. Theory without practice is sterile. Theory becomes a material force as soon as it is absorbed by the masses. So our theoretical founding will only find expression once it is absorbed by the masses. And how do we get to convince the masses? We must know what we stand for. We must be able to have an organization that is able to collectively and individually communicate and persuade as many people as possible of the need for a revolutionary struggle that must bring about economic freedom. So it's individual conviction, organizational conviction, it's mass power, and mass power is going to give us political power. The first option that is expressed in the founding manifesto and constitution of the EFF is that we must fight for political power through democratic elections. Where such is deprived, where the democratic space is deprived, we must fight for political power by any other revolutionary means possible, as long as that any other revolutionary means is based on the support of the masses. But our first attempt and our first struggle is based on pursuit of political power through democratic elections. And if such is deprived, we will engage in other mechanisms, which of course must be deliberated upon democratically amongst all the progressive forces. And once you have gained political power, you will then have access to the state. The state will then give you power to then take the economy and give to the people as a whole. So it is possible to utilize political power to take the economy. We'll give you a simple example that prior 1994, let's say prior 2002, all the mineral rights, even the ones that were not touched, used to belong to the huge corporations, to Anglo-Americans and all these multinational criminal corporations. But just through political power in parliament of passing a law called the Minerals and Petroleum Resources Development Act, we're able to take all the mineral rights to the custodianship of the state, and whoever wants to engage or mine the minerals, whether it be coal or gold or diamonds or platinum or the entire platinum group metals and minerals, someone has to get a permission from the state, which has utilized the political power to take those mineral rights. So we must take political power so that we can use that political power to take economic power, to take back our land, to take back our mineral resources, to develop industry, to create millions of jobs, to deprive everyone else from unnecessary starvation. There's a lot of things that we can be able to achieve through political power here in South Africa and the entire African continent. But all of this requires utmost discipline. So discipline in the struggle for economic freedom is not just a side issue. Discipline is at the center of what all of us should be guided with in terms of how we engage with each other, how we engage organizationally, engage in terms of how we constantly empower ourselves to come with better and superior alternatives to the status quo. So let us, all of us, continue to engage and exchange ideas in terms of what is required of us. We will never associate with any struggles that are not founded on proper theoretical understanding of the EFF. So we want to encourage all of us to read, understand, and internalize the founding manifesto of the EFF. It is the Bible that is going to guide us towards the total victory of all the oppressed and exploited people in the African continent and in South Africa. Let us continue to engage in further engagement. The other commissars and fighters will come to give a better perspective in terms of what we stand for. Let us fight on. The struggle continues. Thank you very much.